Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome everybody to the tonight's webinar on parenting in a time of uncertainty. My name is Dr. John Frampton, and I'm so excited that you're here. Tonight we're hosted by Lakeview Pediatrics, an awesome pediatrician office in Chicago that we've had the pleasure to work towards some great mental health outcomes for their patients. We're just thrilled that you could join us tonight. I also want to thank the co-founder of Formative Psych Services, Dr. Kate Frampton, who happens to be my wife as well, for moderating the questions. She will be, if there's a significant theme of questions happening during the presentation, she's going to interrupt to invite discussion on those questions right in the heat of the moment. Otherwise, we'll take time at the end of tonight's webinar to answer any questions and answers that you may have. And feel free to enter those into the Q&A box and not the chat box, if you would. That would be great. Formative Psych Services is a multi-site private practice. We've got a new office up in Northbrook and a great team up there. We have an office in the Ravenswood neighborhood of Chicago, as well as down in the Loop. We provide individual therapy, school-based neuropsychological assessments, and school consultation services as well. We're really proud of our team, and we're proud of the fact that in 2019, we collaborated and partnered with over 35 Chicagoland school districts in one way, shape, form, or another. And that really is consistent with our principles as a practice when we founded Formative Psych Services, that we believe in the collaborative care model. That when we're serving youth, if we can have you, the parent, the pediatrician, as well as the school on board towards a particular treatment plan for a child, then we see great outcomes. And so we're really fortunate to have some of the partnerships that we have. Tonight, I'm going to be talking for probably about 35 to 40 minutes, depending upon if we hit some questions in the middle. That'll leave us for about 15, 20 minutes of time after, if you'd like to stick around and hear some answers to some questions that may be specific to your situation. And I'm going to just kind of jump right into it. Into this presentation on parenting in a time of uncertainty. So here we go. One of the first things that I like to talk about is because it gives us a nice framework and a nice backdrop, almost like a compass for the parenting decisions we make on a daily basis. And that is trying to simplify parenting into the three roles that I see that we have. Okay. And the first role is typically pretty easy, not always probably, but it's typically pretty easy. And that's that we love our kids. And that started right before before the birth even happened, that we started falling in love with our little kiddo, and started to develop that attachment and being in tune to their needs across the board. And what we know is it's that love, that unconditional regard, that's all important kind of across the board for the child's development as we begin to mirror their emotional expressions even from infancy. And so that's one of the main roles, and it is that unconditional positive regard, that unconditional love, that even when the relationship gets rocky and hits a pothole in the road, that we're able to recover. Even when there's a significant disagreement, that we're showing that unconditional love to our child. The second role that I'm going to talk about, I think, is a little bit more difficult than the first, and it's setting limits. I consider myself somewhat fortunate, having been a principal of a therapeutic day school, having been an athletic coach for a few of my kids, because it gave me a lot of practice in setting lots of rules. And man, my kids are really happy about that. I don't think so. But setting limits is another role that we continue to encourage and that we support for parents to engage in the home. We know that setting limits provides safety and security and predictability. The child knows that if they make decision A, that's probably going to be the response from the parent. If they make decision B, there might be a different response that they can kind of count on. And they know that if another child in the home breaks that same rule, it's probably going to be a similar response. And so we continue to set limits all the way through adolescence. And then we start to negotiate and have to be a little bit more flexible as the child ages into adolescence, into those high school years, so that we can accomplish this last role of parenting, which is fostering independence. trying to make them more and more independent each day. And one of the worrisome things that we know that's happened is the number of kids, of college age students who are living on their own. The number of kids who are struggling emotionally has skyrocketed over the past 2 decades. And so it's our work now, no matter what age your child may be, it's our work now to foster their independence so that we make them a little bit more independent tomorrow, with the understanding that with hunger or with stress, as we're going to talk about, or with feelings of uncertainty, right, we might see about a 50% regression in their chronological age in terms of how they present emotionally, right? But we know that they'll get back on track, and we can do specific things to continue to foster that independence. So I wanted to lay that framework because it's something that we'll refer back to. It's something that you can think about when you're making those daily parenting decisions, to think, okay, well, is this response to this misbehavior, is that just punishment, or is that something that's going to set a healthy limit for them and make them a little bit more independent each day? Because I think that last part is often left off, right? The teaching. If we think about the word discipline, the Latin root word for discipline is to teach. And so whatever act we're taking has that goal of making it so that they're going to have the skill, or more likely to have the skill, to engage in the appropriate behavior that we're looking for. Okay, so we'll keep those in the back of our mind as we continue to move on. And some of you may feel like, man, you know what, through the winter, I felt like I was hitting all three of these. Things were going along pretty smoothly. And then all of a sudden, come February, March, bam, we got COVID-19 in our face and everything gets turned on its head. And that's what's impacted us. Some of you may feel like you were already struggling with some of these roles of parenting. And my hope is that both sets of people will be able to benefit tonight. But COVID-19 has certainly impacted us, right? It has created even more uncertainty than what we were faced with before. And it has created additional stress, additional fear, and additional anxiety. And we know this to be true even from some of the data that's been collected from Wuhan, China, since they got a couple months head start in this whole process. We also know it to be true from other pandemics and epidemics that have happened in our world, that it has a significant impact, even on those post-traumatic stress types of symptoms that exponentially go up when we're experiencing something like a quarantine. One thing that I want to mention, okay, and I'm gonna back up for a moment. I want to mention this, that their kids are resilient, and a good percentage of kids, when this passes, and even during COVID-19, are going to show resilience and have those inherent attributes to make them resilient, okay? And so I don't want all sorts of alarms going off, but it's good to know that we do see an increase in mental health issues when we're experiencing an event such as this. I also want you to know that stress and anxiety are very healthy and very useful emotions when they come in moderation, and when they're very transient and quickly under wraps and quickly under control, so that it doesn't interfere with a major life area. Okay, and I can think of a study that was done in Norway that looked at normal anxiety, and even for those 3rd to 5th grade children, they reported kids who were not evidencing any sort of a mental health issue were reporting once or twice per week feeling overwhelmed and feeling like things got out of control. But they either had the intrapersonal resources to cope with that and get it under wraps pretty quick and move on with their day, or they were able to access those interpersonal resources to get the soothing and calm and support that they needed to be able to move on. I'm going to challenge us for a moment. And this is a big challenge, and you may not be in a place to even entertain this challenge, or to entertain what I'm going to think of as an invitation. And that's an invitation to surrender to or let go of the expectations for what even the next few months may hold. Right? Schools are beginning to lay out their plans. Some schools have made a decision and then gone a different direction. And I think one of the difficult things about COVID-19 is that it presents us with a dangerous trio of factors, and that it's unpredictable, It's uncontrollable, and we don't know when it's going to end. And if we are predisposed to experiencing anxiety, man, that's a really good recipe to feed that anxiety monster. And so we need to watch out for that. Okay. But I'm going to invite us as parents to for a moment, if we can. And again, some of us are triggered. Some of us, our sympathetic nervous system is already on fire, and we're already kind of in that fight or flight mode because we feel overwhelmed. And so if we're not ready for this, that's okay. If you are, then I encourage us to take a moment to surrender whatever expectations we may have for what the fall may bring. And that may allow this amount, this sometimes overwhelming amount of uncertainty to wash over us, wash through us, and get behind us so that we can be a little bit more present in raising our kids. Okay. So uncertainty is certainly there, and it's something to watch out for. And as I asked you to engage in that challenge, or to think about that invitation to surrender to that uncertainty for those things that we can't control, I'm going to steal Mark Brackett's mood meter here for a second. Mark Brackett is an author and a professor at Yale University who recently wrote a book called Permission to Feel, which contributes to the social emotional learning efforts that we do in our schools. And I like his mood meter, right? That the more pleasant we feel and the more energy we have, the more positive our mood is. The less energy, the less pleasant, obviously, the more negative it is. And I'm going to ask you to check in for yourself as a parent. Because if we can't get into that kind of green and yellow area, we may not be in the mode to respond in a helpful way when our kids are challenging our limits, or disagreeing with us, or not following the direction that we just gave them, or having their own emotional meltdown. And there's things that you can do and engage in order to get yourself closer to those green and yellow squares to experience some more of those positive emotions. Okay. But I do invite you to continue to have that kind of self-check-in. And so I'm going to jump right into it. That's as much background as I'm going to give. We could do a whole presentation on anxiety and on stress and on worry. And one thing that I didn't say that I will mention is that when we think about the differences between those three that I just mentioned, right? Again, that stress is really our physiological response to adaptation. When there's something new that we have to get used to, we experience stress. And that's not a bad thing. It creates, if the uncertainty is creating the stress and it's prolonged, then it can become a bad thing, right? Worry is more of the cognitive aspect of it. Those thoughts that start asking those questions, what if? Well, what if the schools do shut down? How am I supposed to get my work done, right? What if our numbers in Illinois spike and we go back to phase 1 and we got to quarantine? All of those what ifs is really representative of the cognitive aspect of worry. We think about anxiety as the accumulation of those, the cognitive response, the physiological response, which leads to our behavioral response. If we get overwhelmed with anxiety, we have a tendency to avoid and back away and not face the very trigger that was making us feel anxious in the first place. So I wanted to mention that for a moment. So I've taken a few of the topics that I'm hearing a lot about from parents within our office, and I know our clinicians, our team of about 10 or 11 clinicians are hearing as well from concerned parents. And one of the biggest ones that we heard, particularly in the spring when the quarantine began and we made the shift to e-learning, is motivation. What the heck happened to my child's motivation? He or she isn't learning a bit. Right. And it was a legitimate concern. And I know that we saw in our house, I'm a father of 3 boys between high school and early elementary school. And we face some of those same issues. Right. And so how do we support increasing motivation, particularly as we think about this fall? And what's important to do is to back up for a moment to think about what are the constituents of motivation? What makes it up? What gives us that intrinsic motivation to get after it? And there's 3, and I take this from the research of Edward Deci. His last name is spelled D-E-C-I, and he's done a good amount of work in this area, intrinsic, extrinsic motivation, as well as self-determination theory. And the 3 components that he and his researchers looked at were 3 areas: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. right? With competence being how confident do we feel? How much self-agency and self-efficacy do we feel as we're beginning to tackle a task? Autonomy being our independence, right? Being able to independently choose the amount of work that we're going to get done, to choose the area within which we're going to work. And finally, the third component of motivation is relatedness, right? Being in that sea of momentum of your peers in the classroom, it almost makes it more difficult not to get your work done, as long as everybody else is on task, right? Being a part of a group. I had the pleasure yesterday of doing a webinar for some pediatric offices on identifying mental health issues in kids and adolescents secondary to COVID-19. I did that project with Dr. Eileen Holt-Turner and Dr. Katie Gorham, who are up in our Northbrook office. We did it as a group. I can tell you I was much more motivated because I knew they were going to do great work. I was much more motivated given my relationship and my relatedness with them, doing it with them to do a good job and to do it on time. Okay. So when we think about those three, we can think about the impact that COVID-19 and our response to it had on all three of those, right? How much competence did we all feel, and did the schools feel, in providing e-learning instruction and using a completely different device, particularly for those younger kids where it was no longer tangible. There was no longer a worksheet that I completed, that I put in, that I was able to put somewhere as evidence that I had completed it. There wasn't the scaffolding and the support to feel competent when I had a quick question about how to do something. Autonomy and the changes in autonomy are amazingly huge, particularly for our adolescents. Right? If I think about our high schooler, we'd say goodbye at 7:30 in the morning and say hello again at 7:30 at night. So he had 12 hours of just being him to do the things that he wanted to do, including his extracurriculars. And that got wiped out, right? All of that autonomy to be independent and be with his peers got wiped out, which leads me to the last component of relatedness, and that one's obvious. That with social distancing, the level and quarantining, the level of relatedness took a significant dip. That helps us understand why we lost so much motivation, why our youth lost some motivation. And we saw that pretty much across the board. And in some ways, we can think about it as a natural reaction. So what do we do about that? Well, there's a few things, and these are just some practical strategies. Our hope certainly is that schools who are engaging in the e-learning are going to be helped by some extra planning time. But realistically, when you think about how many other issues they've got to work on, I wouldn't be surprised if it's still a struggle. So we can do some things at home to help increase their level of motivation. And to speak to that relatedness piece, can we get a few other students that we're going to form kind of a learning team with, where people are being able to check in with each other? I like having the conversation, depending upon the age of the child, of having a conversation about how do they want to see themselves at the end of October? What's going to feel good for them in terms of their report card? What's going to make them feel satisfied in terms of the amount of work that they completed? Right? To picture their future self, and then to start to break down, okay, what do we need to do in the meantime so that you're there and are mirroring that future self? To engage in a conversation about their belief system. What's important to you? Let's make sure, and we all feel a little bit better when our actions are lined up with our belief system. Goal setting. Being able to engage in some goal setting and having those conversations. And then doing some even simple things for the younger kids, creating some very brief 2 or 3 visual checklists of things that they can check off that might be taped to the fridge or to the wall, where they can have that concrete satisfaction of saying, okay, I knocked off 10 minutes of this. Okay, I knocked 10 minutes off of this. It's break time. I get 15 minutes to go do what I want. Let's set the timer, and then we're back to the next checklist. So that's how we're thinking about increasing motivation in our youth as the fall starts to approach. The next area is one of the most difficult, and that is managing technology use. This is one of the more common questions. I do some parent community and school community presentations and trainings, and screen time was one of the, I've probably given about 10 different talks on technology use in kids, and I've got great concerns about what's happening pre-COVID-19, right, where the numbers for adolescents were through the roof, spending on the average between 6 to 9 hours after school with engaged in screen time, which is obviously a major concern. And so what I'm about to say is going to make me throw up a little bit in my mouth, I think, which is we do need to be more flexible during COVID-19. And so we're loosening up what the research really says, and really the take home point in those previous presentations I gave was that once we get to 2 hours of screen time after school, outside of school hours, we start to see some deteriorating effects on mental health. And that makes sense, right? When we're engaged in screen, we're not moving, we're not personally relating with people, we tend not to do things that are productive or in line with our belief system. And so how do we manage it given some of this, right? And what I'm alluding to is that first bullet point, which is we do need to be more flexible. That it may not be a 2-hour cutoff anymore for an adolescent. Those cutoffs actually were much shorter, obviously, for our younger guys, closer to the ballpark of a half hour for early grade school kids. We're going to be a little bit more flexible, and that is going to depend probably on your situation and what demands you have, right? All of us are in a little bit of a different spot. And I'm going to digress for one moment to give you an example of that. There's actually a scale, I'm talking about uncertainty again, there's actually a scale about how we tolerate uncertainty because we're all over the map. Each one of us are likely in a little bit of a different place in how we do with that. And given what our personal situation is, we might need to be even more flexible with the screen time. Now, what is important for us to do is to monitor what kind of screen time they're getting. All the material should continue to be age appropriate. Common Sense Media is a great resource to help determine that. I think as a society, we've slipped way away from what is appropriate for kids and been a little bit lax per my observations. But perhaps we're a little bit more flexible on the amount of time if it's serving that relatedness piece, right? And so if they're playing, even if it's age appropriate for them to be playing Fortnite or Call of Duty, if it's with some buddies of theirs, we can appreciate that there's some relatedness that's happening in that kind of venue. One way to have a conversation with our kids about this is by engaging the family media plan. The American Academy of Pediatrics on their website has a tool called the Family Media Plan, and I really appreciate the setup of it. It's not real fancy. There's not a whole lot of bells and whistles with it, but it does allow us to have a collaborative conversation with our child about how much screen time makes sense. Right. And so that conversation might go something like this. Even when the school year kicks in, if there's e-learning that's happening 100% and we've only got about 4 hours of on time, and then the rest of the time they're off, and that might be being generous in terms of how much on time they're having. Right, we begin to walk it back. All right, that's 4 hours of the day. You got to sleep 11 hours a night. That gets us to 15 hours of the 24 that are taken up. We got to eat and have snack. That's an hour. That gets us to 16. You got to take care of personal hygiene and your bedtime routine. That gets us to 17. It's important that we're doing our chore for the day because you're contributing to the household. I want you to do the reading for the day outside of your homework because that's a family value that we're passing on. We're up to 18, right? You like to play the saxophone or you like to kick the soccer ball. Let's get our time in with that. And perhaps we'll watch a TV show tonight as a family. All of a sudden we're at 21 hours and we've only got a few hours left in the day. And we might say, okay, we got 3 hours left in the day. Do you want that to be, does that make sense for the amount of screen time that we have? And boom, we're off and running. Maybe not that easy, maybe not that seamless in terms of some negotiating that might happen for more time. But again, we're lining it up with what they want their future self to be good at, right? If they want to be a good saxophone player or soccer player, the time is now for some of that practice to begin to happen. Then we may, knowing the addictive qualities of technology, which are well established, and knowing that they light up the same reward center that drugs do for us. We need to, and I'm careful about the language that I use with this, we need to monitor with autonomy in mind. We monitor and we do occasional check-ins that may be as unintrusive as a conversation, or we might just be checking the screen time tracker that's now built into the phone. But to have those conversations with autonomy in mind, and what I mean by that is our purpose in having those conversations is to foster and help them develop their relationship with technology, so that it's not all time consuming and interfering with some of the daily activities that they want to engage in. We don't necessarily want to be hovering and micromanaging their time, because they lose the opportunity to be independent with it. Last thing I'll say about managing technology use is that sometimes when arguments erupt, right? Like, Johnny, come down here, it's time for dinner. Dad, I got playing Fortnite. I got just 2 more minutes. No, your dinner's getting cold. Get down here right now. Right when we're having that kind of conversation or argument, it's not Johnny and Dad fighting. It's the addictive nature of the technology and the 10 engineers who are trying to make their company a gazillion dollars to get your eyeballs back on that machine, collect data from you and get your eyeballs back on that machine tomorrow. You and I need to align a little bit more against that enemy, so to speak. Okay. One of the other things that we want to do, especially because of the uncertainty and some of that uncontrollable feeling that COVID-19 has brought us, is to allow as many opportunities for control for our children as we can. And one simple way to think about this is to think about it in 2 buckets, right? That we have the things that we can control and we have the things that we cannot. We cannot say when a vaccination's coming. We cannot say when life's going to return to normal. We don't know when this is going to end, right? We don't know if we are going to regress in our phases, at least in the state of Illinois, right? So we can look at that and let that frustration and anxiety and stress wash over us. But then we're going to turn our attention and focus on the other bucket. What things can we control? How is our day going to go? If we have people that we feel comfortable being with outside in a socially distant and appropriate manner, who are those people going to be? And let's start arranging that. How am I going to spend my time, right? Routine. When I think about routine, I almost didn't put this up here because it starts to feel like a little boring, right? Like you've probably heard that 10 to 15 times if you're a parent who's trying to read up on what the best approach is these days. But it is all important for us. And the reason that it's all important is that if you remember back in March when we quarantined and our life was turned upside down, right? I can still remember those mornings. They're a little bit of a haze at this point. They actually feel like a year ago, but I can still remember those mornings because by 10 o'clock, I was ready for a nap, right? I was exhausted. And that's because our routines were thrown out the window and we had 1,000 new decisions to make. We had to learn about our kids' e-learning. We had to figure out how we were going to manage our occupation, right? There were 1,000 decisions. And that's the beauty of routines. That's their usefulness, is that when you have a routine, you have a decision set. It's done for you. And that gives us more resources to deal with all the other decisions that we have to make during the day. Choices is another way to foster a sense of control for our kids. And it can be choosing one dinner a week. Yes, we've had breakfast or pancakes for dinner sometimes as a result of that. But it gives the kids a sense of control over what's going on, allowing them to wear what they want to wear while they're engaged in the e-learning, as long as there's actual clothes on, right? But thinking about those types of choices. And there's 1,000 other examples if we were to break down the day, choosing when they're going to do their homework, things like that. Independence days, as I like to call them, right? And that's allowing, especially for those kids that are more self-sufficient in age, allowing them to choose every once in a while a day in which they might just be on their own for the entire day. They might eat dinner on their own. They might fix themselves something to eat, right? It gives the buildup of some of this family tension we may have all experienced during the quarantine, a little bit of a chance to breathe, and then we might actually enjoy our reunification the following day. Okay, so taking time, some scheduled time to take some space isn't a bad thing. And finally, mastery. Now, I'll note this. Some of us are in a position where we're just trying to get by to the next day, right? And it drives us crazy to hear that Johnny down the street has already learned Mandarin, within a few months because he got so interested in it. If there's small things that we can begin to build some mastery in, if there's time for that, and it's okay if there isn't, if there's time for it, wonderful, right? Begin to choose one of those tasks, and it might be that might be one of the family rules that we bring up during the family media plan is there's got to be something. Let's explore this instrument. Let's explore this interest area, this hobby, what have you. How do we support coping in our kids? And this is what the self-regulation piece, right? That when they experience those intense emotions, how do we help them manage those emotions in an adaptive way? And one thing that I'll note about coping is that expression of emotions, really intense expression of emotions, as long as there isn't aggression involved or serious insults being slewed at given to each other, right? That I think our society has moved, the American culture at least, has moved away from this idea that the expression of emotion is somehow unhealthy, and it is not, as long as we're doing it in an adaptive way. So here are some ways that we can reinforce for our kids, and frankly for us, if we're not in in that yellow or green square we were talking about before on the mood meter. Here are some ways that we can begin to cope. And again, I think about breathing like the routine. It's like, oh yeah, I've seen that 1,000 times. There is more research to support the effectiveness of breathing than just about any other coping mechanism. Because when you think about, if we go back to how we thought about stress, worry, and then the accumulation of anxiety, right? If we back it up to that, breathing opposes our sympathetic nervous system reaction to anxiety. Because when we start to feel anxious, right, our breathing gets more rapid, and we get more tense. If we practice breathing exercise like the box breathing method, where we're breathing in on a 3 count, holding for a 3 count, breathing out on a 3 count, holding for a 3 count. And there's over, I think, about 10 other different breathing methods. We are counteracting the very physiological response that anxiety tries to impose upon us. And that's why it's so effective. Exercise is the same thing. The research supports that exercise continues to be more effective than an SSRI in alleviating somebody's feelings of anxiety or depression. And that's because of the chemical reaction we experience after. We also become more available to attending and to learning after a good exercise session. Another way for us to cope, and I think about this more so, is insulation, maybe a little bit less of an active coping method, but insulation from feelings of anxiety and depression during COVID-19 are the 3 dailies. Right? And this is an act of generosity. And what the research says about acts of generosity is that when we do something for somebody else or for something else, that for the next 24 hours, we're less likely to experience feelings of anxiety and depression. And so the 3 dailies are each day we're going to practice. Right? And I'm deliberate about using the word practice because we're not going to be perfect. But if each day we can do something for ourselves, no matter how brief, if we can do something for a loved one, and if we can do something for our community, that's going to give us an extra layer of insulation of any of the anxiety or depressive kinds of symptoms COVID-19 wants to throw our way. Getting out in nature is one of my favorites personally. It's not for everybody, but the research is in the same way as for exercise and for breathing. There's more and more research to talk about this, the natural calming impact of being out in nature and being connected to nature. And it doesn't have to be, we can find nature here in Chicago. It can just be being outside near trees on a city street. There's even some research to show that if you've got a couple plants in your office, that you're going to see a little bit of an impact. And finally, I'm going to end with self-compassion and perspective. I'm going to explain what I mean by these two. that in the same way, we're going to come alongside our kids to support and scaffold and get them through this and to get them through life in general, beyond COVID-19. We need to do that for ourselves. We have a tendency to be self-critical when things are getting a little bit chaotic, and why can't I control this a little bit better, right? Instead of being self-critical, we're going to come alongside ourselves and demonstrate some self-compassion, because that's going to help us in the long run. And man, it's good modeling for our kids to see some positive regard for self, right? And we're going to have perspective, right? We can experience our responses to this uncertainty. We can experience negative emotions, and we can have perspective that this ain't the first a pandemic that's been around, right? And I'll show you this picture real quick, and I need to cite Alan Taylor, who's a senior editor with The Atlantic, who created a photo essay of the Spanish flu. And here's a young lady who's made some toys for refugees in another country in 1918 during the Spanish flu while school was shut down, right? They kept busy. They committed acts of generosity. I couldn't resist with this next picture since the Cubbies are about to start their season tomorrow, but here you go. Here's baseball in 1918. The catcher, the hitter, the batter, as well as the umpire, all got masks on to protect themselves during that time, right? We can feel, we can be anxious, we can get overwhelmed sometimes, and we can keep perspective on where all of this falls. And that leaves us with this last piece, and that's resilience. And you didn't hear me talk about it directly through this arrangement of slides, but each slide that we discussed contributes to resilience. And resilience, as we know it, is our child's ability to persevere through adverse events, right? To make it to the other side. And when they've got a strong relationship with you or another caregiver, when they are able to regulate their emotions and identify their emotions, when they're able to connect with others and have a sense of self-agency, they start to demonstrate what we want our kids to have when they leave our house, which is resilience. And that's that piece. I'm going to stop talking there, and it is time for some Q&A. Oh my gosh, I think I got 40 minutes almost on the nose. I'm going to invite Dr. Kate Frampton, the co-founder of Form to Psych Services, who had her eye on the questions, if there are any. Kate, if there's any themes out there that I can address.
We do have a question here. How do we help a young toddler feel more in control when they are dropped at daycare outside the door to people wearing masks?
Yeah, so that's a great question, right? Toddlers aren't going to be able to benefit from language as much, so I can think about a couple of things that we can do. And one of the things that we want if the masks, if we get the feeling as a parent that for a toddler that the masks are a trigger for their anxiety, first off, I want to check yourself. What's it like for you to drop your child off to somebody who's wearing a mask? Right? If I had posed that question back in January, you'd say, "Oh, I probably wouldn't drop them off." Right? So one of the things that we can do is begin to habituate or normalize that, and that's through ourselves wearing masks. And so when we go out for a walk and somebody's coming down the street with a mask on, pointing that out and normalizing it. The other way that we can do that that's a little bit more play oriented, where that is the piece that I think could allow your toddler to have some control over it. And I wish I had thought about this before, because maybe I could have made some money off the idea, is to create some puppet masks and to include that in his or her creative play. Then they're able to take them on and off, and that's another way to really allow them to habituate to and feel more at ease with the idea of a mask. A very good question. Thank you for that.
That was the only question we have at this time. Oh, sorry, one more. My 9-year-old really regressed during the lockdown / homeschooling. change in eating pattern, and couldn't fall asleep alone. She's very bright, so aware of the pandemic, doesn't watch the news though. Any advice?
Mm. Yeah, and that's one of the things. So we're talking about, fourth grade perhaps, and so you saw a significant change. And what I would want to explore with your 9-year-old is beginning to identify what aspect of the pandemic was scary. There was some research done by a gentleman that looked at, and I don't have the time period that it was done, but looked at people who experienced quarantining versus controls or people who didn't. And one of the things that he noted is that during the quarantining, there was a fourfold increase in the youth's reporting of post-traumatic types of symptoms, right? And so that's really meaningful. I can tell you that across the board, when the quarantining first started, their kids were experiencing more sleep disruptions, right? Again, everybody's world was thrown a little bit upside down. And so there were more sleep disruptions really across the board. If it's held on, I would work to continue to have those conversations about what was it about COVID-19 that feels so scary. And we start vague with those questions, or not vague, sorry, we start with really open-ended questions. And if we're not able to identify, then we can start to give some of those multiple choice questions. I would come at it 2 or 3 times. And if we're not making progress after some effort, I would involve a mental health professional. Engaging in teletherapy, which has a whole lot of research behind it at this point to show that it's efficacious. Getting a mental health professional involved. And one of the ways that we partner with Lakeview Pediatrics is if we see some red flags, we can engage in 3 or 4 sessions of psychoeducation. I call it mental health fluoride, to prevent it from growing into something, right? We don't want to wait much longer if we've made our efforts as a parent to engage in those conversations.
Okay, another question is, when your child has a meltdown that lasts longer than 15 to 20 minutes, is it wrong to ask them to go to their room? How do we get them to calm down when it feels as though there's no end in sight? And then the PS to that is, the child is going into 2nd grade and had anxiety prior to COVID. Now it's compounded.
Yeah, yeah. Great question. And for our kiddos that were experiencing either depression or anxiety and had a little bit of that, even if it's just a sprinkle happening, that's when we see it exacerbate, because there was vulnerability that existed prior to. So certainly can understand that. And Kate, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. When your child has a meltdown that lasts longer than 15 to 20 minutes, is
Got
it
it.
wrong
Thank
to
you.
ask them to go to their room? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
So I think that is okay, right? We try and help them calm, and I think about it not as an isolation, right? We think about time away as a supportive measure for them to be able to get calm again. And so if time away, if especially if the trigger is a sibling or the whatever the trigger is still present, you're supporting that child and saying, hey, head to your room to try on your own to get a hold of yourself for a couple minutes, and I'll be up there in a minute. If there's misbehavior, timeouts are still effective, right? Timeouts are still a very acceptable and very effective measure, but I'm not hearing that, right? They may just be flooded with emotion. And what our goal is, and I'll steal some ideas from Dan Siegel, who's the author of The Whole Brain Child from maybe almost 10 years ago now, right? If we think about from a simplistic standpoint, if our right brain is our emotional and creative center, and that's where we get flooded with emotion, we need to co-regulate, and we need that child to get calm so they can begin to put language to what it is that they're experiencing. And so certainly by heading up to your room, I think that can be really effective to allow them to do that. And the question is, how much scaffolding does your child need? Some kids are able to go up there, scream and cry and maybe pound on the floor with their feet for a couple minutes, and then they begin to calm down. Perhaps they get distracted by something in their room. Some kids are less effective in doing that, and need a little bit more scaffolding. And so it might require, after a couple minutes, the parent going up and beginning to have very little language from the parents' perspective to begin to calm them, right? And by using that calm voice. One thing to know about, if we're feeling triggered because we're just so frustrated about what just happened, give yourself a minute before you go in so that you can be that calming force and be a co-regulator for your child.
Okay, and what are some coping strategies that I can help implement with a 12-year-old who's experiencing trouble staying asleep all night, and would also like some ways to help combat depression? Some
Mm.
suggestions.
So we got a double-headed monster there. Sleep is obviously huge, and we have a sleep crisis developing within our country that's largely related to technology. So this wasn't mentioned, but I'll throw this out there. Certainly no screens in the bedroom, and no screens at least within an hour of bedtime. Right. And so what I would want to do is a little bit of an audit of that sleep hygiene or that sleep routine that happens for that at least that hour before bedtime. I would also want to think about what's happening during the day, how much physical activity there is. We really want the body to be balanced at nighttime. So we've engaged intellectually and we've engaged physically, and that's going to tire us out in the evening. One thing to think about is if that changed during COVID-19 or if that was already existing. But some folks got tricked into, me included actually, when years ago when they introduced the yellow screen on the iPhone that was supposed to omit those the particular blue light and the wavelength of the light that stimulates a part of our body that says don't make the melatonin, stay awake, right? And it did not. I think it got rid of about 5 to 10% of it, right? And so even if we're using that yellow light, we're still telling our body, if we're looking at a screen, then the research says within up to 2 hours. I tend to be a little bit more realistic, and I'll stick to an hour before bedtime. Then we're telling our body not to make that melatonin. And then with the depression, I think that it depends, right? What might be the trigger for the depression? If it's feeling that they aren't belonging, and a 12-year-old isn't belonging within their peer group, then we've got some social skill work to do and some maneuvering to do within their peer group. If it's secondary to COVID-19 and being introverted and not having enough activation during the day, where can we start to plug them in to start feeling an increased sense of self-esteem and self-agency? Great question.
One question to piggyback off of the technology and before bedroom or bedtime and stuff is, the question was, do Kindles with books for reading count as screen time at night?
At night. So that's also a great question. They do, as I understand it, in terms of activation. I think that particularly for younger kids, the research really supports having paper books. And I'll share this with you, and this is coming out of Adam Alter's book called Irresistible, that most of the Silicon Valley higher ups in the companies do not allow their kids before the age of 12 to have an electronic device, because they're very aware about the addictive quality of them, and so they put them specifically, and a lot of them, I think it was something like 2/3 of their kids are in Waldorf schools where they don't use technology until the middle school years to get that paper book in their hands. I don't think, outside of the potential impact on sleep, I don't believe that is counted in that 2-hour screen time, because they're engaged in a really healthy activity.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, how do you keep children that are very athletically motivated for the long-term future, especially high school athletes that have trained for years and are now not allowed to play games and may not be able to go through the normal college recruiting process?
Yeah. So I think we can think about that in a couple of different ways, and it's going to depend on how self-motivated the athlete is, the student athlete is. First, I will say that there's likely some loss to be grieved, as there are for many kids. I've got two nieces, one of whom's going off to play D2 soccer, and they just missed their senior year and missed graduation, and we can understand the losses that that group of kids are experiencing. I would begin to have those kinds of future-oriented talks. What does he or she want their future self to look like 3 weeks from now in terms of personal goals within their athletic area? Sometimes, if resources allow it, hiring a coach to engage in that screen time, even if it were, and we can be really flexible with how we set this up. And I think about the same way as thinking about mental health services during COVID-19. If it were three 10-minute check-ins during the week, I think that kind of relationship and that kind of schedule is much more effective than one 45-minute schedule, 1 45-minute session per week, so that they can continue to stay plugged in. If it's a junior, if it's a senior, at this point they should already be plugged in. If it's a junior, and they've got some ideas of schools that they want to be associated with, I wonder if it'd be possible for them to be a part of a Facebook group of a potential school that they want to get recruited by, so that there's this little bit of sea of momentum for them in getting re-engaged with training.
Okay, now we'll go down for a question about preschooler. Our preschooler started asking for help with skills he had already mastered, such as dressing himself, brushing teeth, etc. We assume that he's trying to get a feeling of control and assured that he's supported. We're trying to balance making him feel loved and supported during a time of uncertainty while still fostering independence. What advice do you have in striking that balance?
Yeah, great question, right? So they already had the skilled master, and now they're asking for help, right? And so we can think about that a couple of different ways as to what the function of that request for help is. And I think in large part it may be about self-regulation. And so one way to balance that, in a way, right, they're looking for your support, looking for your involvement. A question is, depending upon the age of the toddler, is how many times do you need me to help you before you can be back on your own? Because that will allow them to have that control of 3 times mommy, right? And likely when that third time is over, they're going to ask you the next night, and then we can reapproach that question. But we're providing some boundaries, even if we need to be a little bit flexible with the boundaries. That we're providing some boundaries and giving them the control to say, this is how many times I need it, and then I'll be back on my own. And then, if let's say it turns out that it seems that they're just wanting to be with you, or that it starts to take on a manipulative feel, I'd still want to continue to have those conversations with them about what that function is. We can have some conversations and say, hey, I'll keep helping you, but if you can't brush your teeth, how can I trust you to hold my phone during times, and begin to say, what, in other areas of your life, you're really stepping up and doing a great job. What's happening with the brushing of the teeth?
Okay, another question here. Any creative advice on how to keep kids' spirits up when quarantine seems to have no end in sight? The days are long for everyone. We've played every game imaginable.
Yeah, every game, every puzzle, every riddle, every joke has been told, right? Yeah, and we keep going. And I think, that's where some of those independence breaks come in, where we take a break from each other. And continuing to get creative. So one thing that I can think of are pranks, silly pranks that get hidden, where you don't know where it's gonna happen. We did the triple X underwear in our kids' drawer. We've tried the talking toilet paper roll, and since some of those things, I'm blushing a little bit right now and talking about that. But that's one. finding those new areas of mastery, and to know that it doesn't always have to be, together, as a family. But I think having some of those surprises, I think beginning to leave notes in the house, or surprising a kiddo with something in their underwear drawer that could either be funny or loving. Those kinds of things can be helpful. I'm probably not the most creative person in the world, but off the cuff, those are some of the things that I can think of.
Okay. Any advice for kids starting kindergarten? Our son has been in full day daycare his whole life and hasn't engaged in virtual learning yet. Looks like our district might start with 2 days in person and 3 days virtual.
Yeah, so a lot of those back to school routines will still apply here, and that's one way that we can normalize it, right? In talking, going back to school, talking about what it might look like, having them draw some simplistic pictures about what it might look like, perhaps having them make something for the new teacher that they'll be able to hand them in a safe manner. When a child makes something for somebody else, they often can't wait to give it to them, and that type of distraction upon what can be a stressful separation sometimes takes all their attention away from the separation into that act of giving to the teacher. Then sometimes we'll go so far, especially if your child experiences any particular anxiety, of I'm prepping the teacher that the child's going to do that, so he or she knows to be a little bit excited, not distracted themselves when the child comes with that. With the e-learning piece, that's a little bit harder probably to prepare for, because we don't know which format or which tool is going to be used. Is it a laptop? Is it a computer? Um, 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 but seeing if there's anything, even a quick Khan Academy that's age appropriate to do some practice with, so the child feels like, oh, and that helps build with the motivation, that it builds a little bit of sense of competence, that if you're able to present something online that's within their wheelhouse, that we're going to give this kindergarten thing a try the week before school starts, and they knock it out of the park, man, then they're walking in with a good amount of confidence on the first day of school. And I know we're getting
Okay.
close. Maybe we'll take, if there is one more, Kate, we'll take one more and then we'll wrap up for tonight.
I think that is all of the questions that we've
Awesome.
received.
Well, great questions. Thank you so much, everybody, for your time tonight and for being with us. We are going to upload. This was recorded tonight, so we'll upload this to Formative Psych Services YouTube channel. And so if you're on YouTube and you want to search it, Formative Psych Services, it's free. It won't be password protected. Feel free to share it with friends. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great night.